as well to think about that piece of translating the recommendations into policy action and possibly additional partnerships between UVM as the university partner and others on this call. So very briefly, the 8 recommendations were creation of inclusion-centered policies. So basically looking at things like Head Start and Early Head Start, where it's just policy and practice to say no child will be suspended or expelled. Creation of a unified data system, and I have a lot of thoughts about that. So when we get to discussion, I'll circle back to that one. The creation of a uniform or unified professional development system. And I'm going to tag Katie on that one because I know she has a lot to say about professional development systems. Looking at the workforce holistically, is there equity in wages? Is there equity in access to supports for workforce across these different settings that we're looking at? Examining the feasibility of implementing early MTSS, which ties into Lori's other project that is part of our conversation today. Evaluating the use of one-on-ones. What we did discover in the PIES study was that the primary support for children with special health needs is trying to access a one-on-one, primarily through special accommodation grants. And we know that not all early learning settings are well versed in how to access that funding. We know that the funding runs out about 2/3 of the way through the year. So families, even if they do need it, if they're asking for it later in the year, it's then unavailable, and it kind of leaves them with no other support to turn to. So thinking a little more creatively about, what other supports at a more, if we use the early MTS pyramid model, what other universal supports could be put in place, what other intermediary supports could be put in place. And then for those kids that really are at the top of the pyramid in terms of needing support, that's when the one-on-one should be utilized. Also creating the process for a warm handoff. When I did the interviews and focus groups with parents, a lot of them said that, they understand that their children have complex needs. They understand that not every setting has the confidence or the training to meet the needs of their kiddos. I was really impressed with what I heard from the professional's point of view and the family point of view. There is a lot of empathy and understanding about the complexity of the situation. But what really frustrates parents and families is when they're told your kid, this isn't the right setting for your child, this setting is not a good fit, is kind of the language, the code that, that basically your child's being expelled from the center. But there is no support in figuring out, well, where can I take my kid? I want to work. What are my alternatives? And so what are some of the responses from state agencies where we could say, families should have some supports in that intermediary time and then assistance in getting their kids settled in a new childcare setting. And then collaboration, more collaboration across these different agencies. So obviously CDD and CIS and Agency of Education, but there may be others that should be part of those conversations. So that's just a quick review, and I'll turn it over to Katie to see if there's any more that she wants to add before we open it up for the larger discussion.
Well, what I would add is that when I looked at some of the questions that were sent, they are questions that we can't answer by ourselves, right? In isolation, things about federal funding, things about next steps that involve a lot of coordination. For the recommendations that Valerie was just sharing, it gives me hope, and it is heartening that we are already working towards some of them right through our legislative agenda with regards to the workforce. The systems analysis study that is currently happening will help in terms of collaboration and maybe even like a PD system, like really thinking about how things can be better aligned. And then we have the data work that is going on, right? So I think as a state, we are moving towards things, but I think we have a lot of the key players on this call to have a really informed and helpful discussion.
So there is many avenues where this conversation can go next. And so keeping focused on how can we take what we've learned from the report and make it actionable, and what's the next best step soon that we can take in light of some of the most pressing needs right now around families who have children who are struggling due to specialized needs and struggling to stay in their early care and learning settings and access those settings. What might we do to improve their experiences right now? So we really would like to have this be a conversation, because this is not something that any one of us can do in isolation.
Thank you, Lori and Kate, for the information. And just a reminder to this committee that one of the tools that you have available to you is to issue policy recommendations, right? And that's something that typically is, they are published in the State of Vermont's Children and endorsed by the State Advisory Council. And it doesn't have to be once a year, right? Like, so it could be something that this committee elevates now and will be included in the future. So just a reminder that that is one of many tools to be able to elevate this as an issue.
I see James has his hand up.
Thank you, Sherry. Yeah, Valerie, as you were talking about the kind of scenario with special needs kids and not a good fit, it reminded me very, very much of our patient challenges here at SVMC, how sometimes we have these patients that don't fit with the primary care provider, they still need services, it gets very complicated very quick for certain patients. And what we've created, which I think is we created a couple of years ago, and it's evolved a little bit since, and it absolutely works fantastic now, is if we have one of these patients that's kind of like, what do you do? It fits between things. We have a community care team, and the community care team is made up of all of these different agencies. There's, I think, 12 or 15 different, there's insurance there's state agencies, there's case managers, there's council on aging, there's lots and lots of different people in the room. And basically what you do is you sit down and you say, what are we gonna do with Jim Tremarky? And everybody's in the room all at once, and in about 15 or 20 minutes, it's amazing how quickly we can create a really comprehensive and sensible plan that stabilizes the patient, moves it forward. I'm wondering whether or not a similar type model couldn't work in childcare. You mentioned that there's several different agencies that they bounce between, and childcare workers, et cetera. But if they were all in the same room and they all said, what are we gonna do with Jimmy Tremarky? And, this isn't a good fit where he is right now, but what are the options, whether that wouldn't really expedite the movement and the plan forward for the child.
Thank you. I'll take a moment to respond to that. So thank you for sharing, James. That process reminds me of another process that I'm aware of. Some on this call may also know of this, but the local interagency teams. Now that's for kids that are already in the K-12 system, but a student, usually they have child welfare system involvement. So it's kind of a collaboration between Family Services Division, Agency of Education, but there can be many other agencies that participate in those meetings, and they'll say, who are some of the kids that seem to be struggling, and we may need a different plan than what's currently going on in terms of their public education. So that could be a model that the different agencies address to expand something like that to younger children that are in childcare and preschool settings. My only hesitation is that, for families, that is a timely process, right? There's got to be a meeting and a convening and then a plan made, and then so there could still be a significant delay. Personally, what I would love to see is if the use of the one-on-ones was reevaluated. So first of all, if the one-on-one financing was expanded, but also the use of one-on-ones in situations where it's not actually necessary that the child have a one-on-one, if that be evaluated and some of that financing kind of recaptured, could one-on-ones be put in place with those kids when they are about to be expelled from their childcare setting, to give the parents, you know, a couple to meet with a team to say, all right, who are the childcare centers available in the geographic area that you're looking for, who has, you know, capacity and the skill set. So I think possibly a blend of what you're suggesting, James, with some of the other recommendations that we put forth could work, absolutely. And I saw there's a number of hands up. I saw Amy had her hand up, so I'll bounce the question to Amy next.
Thanks. Well, this is, this is something that on the early team, we certainly hear about quite often, programs struggling to support children. And I thought Caitlin brought up a really good point about other supports, looking at other supports while we're trying to figure out, what to do about, how programs are getting those special accommodations grants, and that's including that early MTSS pyramid system, getting that in place, and not just waiting for that special accommodations grant to come through, but hopefully having some supports and practices in place for those programs, which of course then comes into play the training that's needed, the coaching that's needed, and that PD system that we were talking about. I mean, that's something that all of public and private programs could benefit from. So that's what we're struggling with. I know from the AOE standpoint, the early team standpoint, we actually applied for some grants through Title IV funds, and we've been told tentatively that we've been approved, but all of that is focused on providing training to public and private programs, with the understanding of early MTSS and pyramid practices and how to get those practices in place. And then kind of looking at what do we still need to do to support those children and programs. So that's where we're at.
I think Cynthia and then Diane.
Thanks, Sherry. Hi, everyone. I've been muddling around in my head. Of course, the foundational preparation of our workforce, I think, is key, right? So I love that whole concept. I know from personal experience, it was often staff burnout that also helped precipitate kind of that conversation about, is this the right setting? And often that is code for the classrooms just don't have the supports they need, and the teachers don't have the training or supports they need as well. It's not as much about asking really a family to leave. I think that's typically pretty heartbreaking. And at my program, we did have a policy. We didn't expel any child, but there are major ramifications, I think, around that. Other families leaving a program, if they feel the program is unsafe, staff leaving when they're burned out. I see some head nods. So I really appreciate this conversation and the idea about, training people from the ground up. I'm curious, I have two sort of thoughts in very different tracks, and I'll put them out, and they might not need an answer. They might just need to be parking lot someplace warehoused. But the first is, how do we really work with our institutes of higher education to think about what those teacher preparation programs look like and how to integrate some of this foundational knowledge that we're talking about in this system from the ground up. And I know that there's a lot of work going on there. I know there's been a lot of articulation agreements in the systems, but I really am just thinking, especially with TEACH accessing our state institutes of higher education, how do we really build that more comprehensively across those teacher preparation programs that are accessible in Vermont? So that's the first sort of strain that's tumbling around in my head. The other strain that I have is a question about, and this one really maybe need to be tabled, but again, in my experience, I had, early childhood programs work with multiple school districts. And so where does this local school district, i.e. EEE in particular, so 3 to 5 year olds, how is that system really impacting accessibility, availability, and compatibility, if you will, or consistency, right, across school districts for early childhood programs that might be serving children from various school districts who have special needs and who are trying to monitor and connect and read language and styles across school districts. And I think that is another major piece about this body of work, that in Vermont, we just have this need to have, sort of this local control around our school districts. And I completely agree, and I understand where this is coming from. In the early childhood field, though, because we work across so many systems, that in and of itself can be an enormous barrier and challenge to try to figure out that consistency. So that's just another piece that's bubbling up for me here in this discussion. I really appreciate all of this.
Thanks, Cynthia. I think we'll go.
I think
Diane.
that sort of points to the, like, that district boundary issue of like early childhood special educator resources stay within the boundaries of typically the district that they're in. And that's where parents can take their Act 166 money and go to any childcare or any early care program. And then that creates that inequity of, but getting your services out of your town or out of your district.
We have Diane, Keith, and then Sonia.
So good morning. So one of the things I'm wondering as I'm looking at this and thinking about it is the timeline. So, so often we get stuck because there's so much right here, right now. And to me, it would be helpful to look down the road to say, this is where we're hoping to be by this date, so that then we're taking out those little bites, which the report had some very good concrete things. And then I'm also wondering about pockets of money that are out there. And I do think we have a system of meeting and brainstorming, but then it's always the action steps that fall apart because we don't have the capacity. And so how do we build, to me, the question is, how do we build capacity within each program for them to be able to do tier 1 work, as well as expanding to the needs when those kiddos come in that need the extra support? Because we're also, at least in my area, we're feeling that burnout of the stress of just the everyday. And so if we can shore up the capacity and the strength of the people who are there, and then add into that and create, even if it's potentially with ARPA money being so temporary, and I don't know if there's extra that could be applied to this, but even if there were teams in each district that could really focus heavily in each district as dedicated, because we know the coaching is that critical piece to it, then we could potentially shore up, as long as we have very clear guidelines and indicators. My worry is, and it's for whatever reasons, our systems are strained. And so when money comes into one chute, it sometimes gets stuck and can't get out. And so whatever we work to do, we need to be sure that the plans that are in place and the timelines that are set are able to be implemented.
Keith, you had your hand up. Did you want to?
Yeah, thanks. Just from a few comments ago, just James' idea. I mean, that does exist within the CIS framework for children who are clients there. So it's a small subset, but that referral meeting and the teaming does happen in these instances. But to several other folks' points, capacity is then still an issue. That team can happen and a plan can be made, but if there's not another spot with capacity to support that child, options are limited.
And Sonia, I think you were next. And then we'll pop over to the UVM team who have their hands up also.
Good morning. Yeah, so sort of agree with pretty much everything everyone is saying right now. To me, it's a continuum, right? And there are some big gaps in that continuum in private programs. So it does start, as Cynthia said, with teacher preparation. And I do think we need to pay very close attention to what that looks like. But I will say that even my most seasoned bachelor licensed teachers will still struggle. Okay, so then you go to the next, assuming you've done the proper preparation, the next is potential coaching and mentoring when folks start to struggle, right? And there's almost zero access to that in the private sector, zero. And below that, or even above, or I'm not sure in what sequence, but the team that people are talking about, there is no team. That doesn't exist. You don't get a team until a child needs services or you make a referral to CIS or Triple E. So that piece would be super helpful, right? So that just doesn't exist in this line with private programs. So that would be super helpful. Sometimes, honestly, once you've done all those things, just some extra help and time in the classroom with somebody helping can really make a huge difference in bringing a teacher or a team of teachers and the student to a place where they can then kind of soar from there and keep the progress going. But if none of that works, you then end up with a referral, right? So given that we're missing two of the steps in that, that's in essence a huge reason a lot of children end up getting one-to-one aids, or we get to the point where we feel they need one-to-one aids. But assuming all that, you make your referral and then you do have a team, right? Because once a student is now observed, found to be eligible, you now have a team. And in terms of getting, a SAG grant, that only happens with the support of a team and service providers. You can't even get one without that. So I don't believe they're frivolously being given out. I just want to point that out. Like any that we have or have had, these are children with very significant needs, right? Whether they're either health, a child with cerebral palsy, autism, whatever, they're very significant and they're having a major impact on the classroom. And you also have to remember in all of this, this is a private business. And our parents will literally leave, unlike a public school. They will go if a child is dangerous, right? And we don't have the tools and support to help manage that situation and really get a grip on it so that we can actually be bringing the child along and they're progressing and, not just putting out fires all day. We start losing clients. So I think that's the point at which people go, I'm sorry, but they have to go. I now have 10 parent complaints. I've had 2 people pull. I mean, those are the times where people go, help, right? So I think we're just, to be a little shorter, sorry, I feel like we're just missing some key places in the sequence of what I think would really help the situation in general. And I really feel like once you've got that grant, I don't feel like they're being used frivolously because it took a team of service providers to support that to even happen. But I feel like we could avoid probably half of those if we had the others in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. I will leave it to Valerie, Katie, and Lori you've heard quite a bit of discussion and let you guys respond your thoughts.
Oh, I was going to say Valerie had her hand up first.
Great. Yeah, I agree with you, Sonia. I think we're actually on the same page in that if those other 2 missing steps were put in place, I think as researchers, our question is how many kids would then have the universal and intermediary level supports that they wouldn't rise to the need of needing the one-on-one. So I actually really agree with your perspective. I want to go back quickly to just this point about when kiddos are getting their child care or they're in a private pre-K outside of their school district, right? But then maybe they're getting Triple E and it has to be within their school district. So as a mom of a special needs child, I was in that situation. And here's the place where, I don't have the policy knowledge to know how to make this happen, but I'm like, why doesn't my son's school money just follow to where I need him to be, right? Because we know a lot of parents might live in one town, they might work an hour away, and it's a lot easier sometimes to take your kid along for the car ride in the morning to drop them off. Otherwise, you're going to look for a place that opens at 6:30 in the morning. If you work for the state, you got to be there 7:45, as many of you know. So like, there's a lot of logistical things that make it difficult sometimes to keep your kid in the same town where you live. So I'm looking to those of you on this call that are those policy experts to say, can the money follow the kiddo? Because I know a lot of families would be a lot less stressed if that was the case. And then a couple things regarding the other recommendations I just want to touch on quickly. One is the idea of cross-system collaboration. To put it really simply from my point of view, we know for children, all environments are learning environments. So when we went into this, we knew we were looking at several different very specific settings. So we talk about in the report, daycares and private pre-K and public pre-K and other things. And we had to come up with this kind of umbrella term that covered it all, which, you know, is early learning childhood settings, right? It's kind of a mouthful. But we know that even if your child is in, quote, a daycare, that's still a learning setting, right? So when I think about the collaboration across CAS, CDD, AOE, and other agencies, you know, I know that there is the governance study happening, and a question is, you know, what is the right kind of, you know, hierarchical and also horizontal structure for these different agencies? But it's all our kids are learning. It's kind of like, you know, it doesn't matter that we've siloed this from a governance perspective. The learning is happening regardless of where the kids are at. So I would, you know, I would really push hard on this piece around collaboration across agencies, just because of the nature of the way these young people are experiencing learning in the settings. And then the other is creating a data system. So those of you that know me know my big thing is data, right? Because we need to review the data, understand what is and is not effective. These agencies that we're talking about, Agency of Education, CDD, and CIS, you know, you're not the only government agency in the state that needs a new data system. I happen to know, you know, I used to work for Family Services. They've been asking for a new data system for at least 10 years. So how can all the different subdivisions of state government that have antiquated data systems that don't work for the people that need to use them efficiently, how can you kind of all collectively raise your voices to say, Family Services needs a new data system, CDD needs a new data system, AOE needs a new data system, and just, you know, is there a way to kind of bring your different siloed dollars together, as someone was mentioning earlier, to advocate? And I think you could make the argument, some American Recovery Acts, you know, how are we knowing how kids are doing after COVID unless we have a data system? If I was someone that was handing out the grants for that, that's an easy sell to me. We don't know if kids are doing better or worse unless we have the data to track it. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Katie.
Thanks. I'm switching gears a little bit because I'm going to go back to kind of the coaching and mentoring comment that Diane brought up and then Sonia built on. I think Sonia highlights something really important in that our system is inequitable, right? As it is right now. I have put in for grant funding, but have not been successful in wanting to fund a study about how different districts have actually crafted leadership structures because there's an absence of guidance in our policy. Right. So we have a pre-K policy, we have childcare policies, Head Start has performance standards and policies that they follow. They all identify different things. And so when we have a mixed delivery system, there's actually a major lack of infrastructure at a local or district or regional level about how to successfully implement that. And so some states that have really strong state office to community implementation and connections that run early childhood programs actually mimic their state system at the local level. And like West Virginia does this, and they do it really well. And that means that somebody at a district can always know who their point person is to get advice from, to help them understand how to braid funding, whatever it is. When we talk about adding coaching and mentoring to early childhood, I think we need to flesh out who pays for that, where it comes from so that it can be sustainable, and how it would be implemented so it can be equitable. And one of the ways that I think we could do that is through pre-K policy. I think if we adopted a policy like New Jersey has, where it says, great, you want to be in mixed delivery pre-K, here's the things you need to be willing to do. And if your district has X number of kids that it is serving, you are going to get so many coaches and master teachers. You are going to have an early childhood supervisor, and that person is responsible for all of mixed delivery. Those coaches and master teachers go to all the mixed delivery settings. They even will partner with Head Start so that the district maybe pays 0.75, Head Start 0.25. Like, there are different ways to make, if we want this to happen, we want it to happen for all children in all settings and for all teachers in all settings. And I think it would be especially important because it's going to be difficult to make some of these top tier system level changes. And so if we can improve our policy to build out some infrastructure that would be responsive to what we need, I think that's great. I also think it partners well with increasing the education and well-being and compensation of the profession, in that there are then more places to go. Then we are creating leadership pipelines. We are creating master teacher and coaching pipelines. And I think we already have some models for how to do that. And I think then once it's in policy, we can find the funding streams to make it successful and lift the burden on district superintendents and those types of things who don't always know what's happening in early childhood.
And Katie, there is a question for you in the chat that I can read. Is the assumption that school-based pre-K have coaches and master teachers available or need them less?
My assumption?
Sorry. Yeah, this is Janet. Sorry, I'm off video. Yes, that was just in what you were talking, in what you were saying, you sort of were talking about a system of coaches and master teachers to be available for the private settings. And I'm curious about that versus the public. Like, I couldn't quite tell. Are you saying that's because public schools already have it, or because they don't need it, or what you're saying?
It follows the public money, right? And so public, but it would only be pre-K. That's the policy that I'm thinking we could fold it into most easily, that I actually know there are models of. And that infrastructure supports where that public pre-K money goes. So whether it is in a childcare setting or whether it is in a school-based setting. And I think that is particularly important because often in school-based settings, you know, there might be limited access to professional development or mentorship opportunities if someone is being overseen by a supervisor who's located in a different school, right? When I started to look into the leadership infrastructures that do exist, there are a few that use, like, one principal oversees early childhood and public pre-K across the district. Some have pre-K supervisors, other have early childhood and special education coordinators, right? Like, those are three very different jobs that already have jobs that pre-K was just kind of loaded into. But I think what those roles do that is concerning to me is that they leave out the rest of the system.
Okay, thank you, Katie. That's clarifying. I just, I guess I felt like when you were talking, I felt like the way that some people could hear it, or people, even like people like me who are, right, I'm not an expert in this, right? I'm not an early childhood educator in training. That it sounded like sort of like this is a support that was just needed in the private settings and not in the public settings, but
No,
that's not what you meant.
No, that is not what I meant. So thanks for letting me clarify, since it's being recorded, and like, gosh knows what happens when these things get recorded and then you get taken out of context, and oof. So thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to clarify that.
Thanks, Katie. I think Patty, you.
Oh yeah, and can I add to that too, before we get to Patty? Sorry, Patty. So the comments that I wanted to add really do echo a lot of what you just said, Katie. So I think when we wait for a referral in order to access supports and services, we're really placing the problem in the child, and that's not the problem. The child's not the problem. We really do need to find a way to bring equity to all of our settings. And so, Katie, I do think that public, pre-K dollars and that policy piece is probably an easy win and a good avenue. I'd really like to start the conversation of how do we make this for everyone in early care and learning? Where do we braid the funds? Where do we find the funds? How do we fund those pieces that Sonia are saying, key parts of the system that are missing? It's all that middle level when expert teachers get stuck and they don't know where to go. They don't know who to turn to, what to do. And we're hearing stories from families where, their programs are being hesitant to take their children because they're concerned about a child's behavior. And Sonia's perspective is right. They are businesses and they have to make decisions that they think are going to keep all their children safe and families satisfied. And so we don't want to see children and families turned away for something that could be solvable. And so one of the recommendations that came out of the early MTSS project was something similar to what James, you were saying earlier, is how do we, because we have these localized systems that can be complicated, how do we create regional teams or even more localized teams to that to support the entirety of the early care and learning settings that make up their area? We have to think more deeply about that. And I really do think the piece that we need to move on is coaching and mentoring. And that's something I don't think we can wait for, because that's the piece where people are being impacted right now. Without coaches and mentors, we have the teacher burnout and stress. And without the coaches and mentors, children are being turned away. And when we had a lot of interest in people learning the tools and the skills needed around the pyramid model, but when people attended the training, we also asked, would you want to use your expertise for other programs in your area? Would you like to be called on to be a mentor or a coach? And kind of like, leaders already have jobs, teachers already have jobs. They don't have bandwidth to take on coaching or mentoring, but they want to do it within their own individual setting. So right now we have people using their skills in their individual settings, but they're not necessarily sharing them for the greater good of the community. So what do we need to put in place to make that happen? Okay, thank you. And Patty, I'll let you go next, please.
Sure, thank you. I just wanted to mention some work that had been on pause for quite a little while that is due to start again, and that's the statewide interagency agreement for early childhood children with disabilities. And I know Amy will be a part of that and maybe some other people, but the last time we came together to update that statewide agreement was 2010. And at that point, we were updating every 3 years, coming together as a committee and saying, is this still relevant? What changes, updates need to be made? And so, as you can imagine, there are many updates needed, many things that have happened since 2010. But the other thing that, so Renee Kelly, the Head Start Collaboration Office Director, is the person that will be leading that update. And she had a fantastic suggestion of inviting district folks, school district, CIS, inviting our partners to the Head Start agencies that are working on working on that work group, to invite our partners to sit down and look together what makes this agreement most useful for us. And the process is that we update the our local, we review and sign annually. And so that's an opportunity to really talk about how we work together in each individual school district. As folks have mentioned, there are many. So there are 20 school districts that are within the Champlain Valley Head Start region. Of course, we don't work with all of them regularly, but that's a lot of different folks, different systems to be working in. So, so I think that's going to be a real opportunity to work out some of these things. And I have one tiny little update. So we do have a school district that is going across the school district lines and providing services in the child's full day Head Start Center so that the child can stay there. PT, OT, speech, and special educator are all coming to make sure she can stay. So that's a fantastic success story. And one last update, sorry for taking so long, but the new-ish problem that we are facing this year and is just the number of children in the classroom that do have identified needs and sometimes significant needs. So the new early Head Start classroom that started at Riverside, there are 6 out of the 10 children that will have one plans probably very soon, right? So 2 came in with identified needs and 4 referrals since September. So in thinking about how to provide an inclusive environment for children and all of the, children on the wait list for some of our classrooms, are all children with IEPs. And so that's sort of new this year. And I think that folks are seeing a greater number of children being identified right now. So that's not just us. Thank you for letting me say 3 different things.
Thank you, Patty, for sharing that. And I think, that last part of what you shared is what, some of us are hearing from other programs as well, as the increased number in children that are being identified as needing, additional supports and all of these pieces not being in place. I wanted to just summarize a little bit of sort of what we've talked about before. I mean, it's up to this point, and then continue the conversation. So I think there was a lot of consensus just around the preparation and professional development, being available at the base, at the foundation. That's a really important piece that we want to look at, make sure is in place. I think it's, important also to think about that can look different for what the needs of in terms of when it's offered, how much it is, what time, all of that is different between private and public settings. And often, as someone who's worked mostly in the private setting, what has been offered isn't a realistic fit for, early childhood educators working in private settings. And there is a project right now that the city of Burlington is supporting with their recovery dollars, in where they are offering early MTSS training for 25 early childhood educators, and they're compensating them for completing that training, which is a model that blows the private early childhood educators' minds that they actually can participate in that. And I'm really hoping Lori has reached out to that project, because I'm really hoping that we can learn a lot from the delivery model that they're setting up, and could that be something that could be replicated statewide. The other thing that we've talked about is those gaps around team consultation and that short-term support. I think that's such an important part. It was reiterated a few times here, and I think I heard a lot of agreement around, kids are being really impacted significantly when a couple of weeks support might have changed the whole trajectory of what happened to them next and what happened to their family. And that just seems really urgent. And I, just from my perspective, appreciate that being brought up and put forward, because I agree 100%. So that just seems something that's really resonating. Also, Katie bringing up how pre-K policy could be a vehicle. I know it's only that 3 to 5 year old age, but let's start somewhere. Could be a vehicle for increasing the resources that are available for coaching and specifically mentoring. So I think that's a great it's aspects of this discussion to maybe dig deeper in a little bit. Also, the impact of silos. The lack of data, and the Patty just talked about Champlain Valley Head Start working with 20 different school districts. That's exactly the situation for private programs in the Champlain Valley, because this is such an area where people commute to work when they are working with universal pre-K, if they're a universal pre-K service provider. That's exactly what Cynthia started the discussion off with, in terms of how many different districts, processes, temperaments, philosophies you have to deal with when you're trying to get help for a child in your program. That was some of the discussion that happened. And I also just wanted to, a few years ago, Stacy Curtis from Burlington School District was trying to pilot a program where she could collaborate with other schools and offer, special ed services for other districts in the Burlington area. She is a special ed director for the Burlington, or early childhood director for Burlington City Schools. Sort of like, she was trying to fill that need, understanding that a lot of children may be in Burlington for childcare, but outside of Burlington is where they live, and was trying to create these collaborative agreements. She had little success in that, but maybe it's a model that could be tried again. And the idea was that schools would contract with Burlington to provide services for the children from their districts that may be enrolled in programs that are in the Burlington area. Any other, I'm just trying to think, those are some of the pieces. That's what I heard. Did I miss anything in this summary so far? And the other thing that Valerie specifically said is around, maybe there could be the funds, or look at the SAG grants or the SAG funds in a way that maybe there's some set aside for some of that really short-term support when there is a child who's at risk of being asked to leave a program. And so there's some short-term emergency support that is there so that, they can get some time to figure out what comes next. So that was also an actionable item we might want to consider.
Yeah, just following up on that, I just want to note, as I said in the chat, that the specialized childcare coordinators that I've been talking to in my facilitation role are very much interested in this discussion about the future of SAG and long-term adjustments, changes, etc. I don't know who all those people are, so I apologize if one of you on this array is in fact a specialized childcare coordinator. I just know that 2 or 3 that I talk to frequently because of our internal working group, and Keith knows about this because we've been trying to share concerns with his team. They're also working on this. Credit where credit's due. They're trying to figure out what to do about this. I think there's a whole conversation about this that is for your notes, Sherry, I think some of it is sort of short-term reaction response, right? And not just, I don't mean the 2 week right away versus the 6 month. I mean, like, can we do something in the next 6 months, as opposed to having a very large step back and say, do we need to redesign the entire thing, which is what the PIES study is saying, right? So I just want to note that the specialized childcare community is very much, specialized childcare coordinator group is very much wanting to be part of this discussion. I'm not sure they're represented in this group today. So if someone did want to carry that conversation forward, speaking for them, I know they would want to be involved in that discussion. So that's one. Second, to get to your other point, and I know this is an extremely sensitive topic, quite a few years ago now, the Alliance did try to coordinate a conversation about this question of delivering services across school district lines. It was an extremely challenging conversation. It did not result in any positive outcome. It's a perennial conversation. And again, some entities that are not represented in the array of tiles today have a lot to say about this. And, I have an opinion about their position on it, but suffice it to say, it's complicated. There are many stakeholders. I think it's a conversation that's far overdue. But if it does proceed, all the stakeholders need to be at the table. Otherwise, we're not making progress anyway, but we certainly won't make progress unless all the stakeholders are at the table. So I'll leave it at that, Sherry, just for your note taking. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Just checking. So I'm wondering, just to hear from others, are there, kind of to piggyback on what Matt said about, what is the short term versus the, versus a redesign. Are there some short term, let's focus on that first, some short term actions that you might consider or recommend, or that the ELD might adopt to recommend, that you've heard during the discussion? they don't have to be fully flushed out, but are there like things popping up that feel like, that might be something we want to try to get in place, in the short term? Cynthia.
Thanks, Sherry. I think Diane had her hand up first. So Diane, I'm going to defer to you. I'll go right after you.
Thanks, Cynthia. All I was going to say is that the report did have a nice timeline, and it seemed to me that while it's only one portion of the system, I think it would be helpful if information that we've received and has been researched, if we could figure out how do we implement that timeline, and then mesh it with whatever comes up forward.
And Sherry, I'm sort of ruminating on everything that's been said. I wonder if there's an opportunity, this is sort of short term, maybe medium term, but thinking about the Build Back Better and ARPA funding that's potentially right ahead of us. And thinking about those families that are more families that are being identified now, and then the potential to turn them away because our workforce is really struggling. Is there some policy that this group could promote to our Agency of Education, to our Child Development Division around how ARPA funds or Build Back Better funds might be distributed? And of course, Building Bright Futures is doing a ton of work on this, so it all fits into that too. But specific to maybe those short-term supports, so coaches, consultation, access to professionals to help classrooms and families and children immediately. So that was sort of one policy thing I've been thinking about and how that might fit into that funding. And then I had another one and it just went out of my head, so I'll be quiet. Typical day.
You can have another turn, Cynthia, when it comes to you. Valerie had her hand up.
Great, thank you. Thinking about those short-term intermediary steps, right? And then versus the bigger picture. And there was a question, that you asked us about today, but what is the role of the university? So we did touch on, obviously the university does help prepare the next generation of teachers and educators, including early childhood and early childhood special educators. But because I am at the Center on Disability and Community Inclusion, I'm just going to put a quick plug in for the fact that, referrals can come into our I-team, our early I-team. We also have the BEST team, which implements PBS. And I know Lori's project was looking at early MTSS. My understanding is, my colleagues on the BEST team weren't really as much a part of that. But there are resources available at the university that both public and private centers can be tapping into. Now, and one of the good things with COVID, the silver lining is as we've pivoted to virtual, there used to be a lot of geographic limitations in folks on those teams going out to different settings. But I know early I-team and I-team have now made significant investments in video technology. So, they can send you a camera that a teacher puts up in the class and they'll observe the class and they'll say, okay, which student should I be keeping my eye on? And actually the thing that happens, I forget the scientific term for it, but when the kids act differently because they know there's a stranger in the room, right? That's not happening because it's just a camera. You can hide it, you can do whatever, and the kids are acting more naturally. And so then folks on the I-team or early I-team can provide that coaching to the educational team to say, this is what we're seeing, and have you tried this strategy and that strategy? So I just want to put a plug in for that. And then I wanted to mention quickly to this idea of what are the steps that are right in front of us that we could collectively be advocating for? And then what are the bigger pieces, right? And as someone, that tries to, understand the process of systems change and system implementation, I think we're all aware that for a while, to do this successfully, for a while, we have to convince the legislators and, those who have the authority to make decisions that we have to have a dual process for a while for this to be successful. We can't take away what we're doing while we're scaffolding something new, because that's just going to create more of a vacuum. We have to kind of maintain what's going on. So we have to maintain the SAG funding, at least as it is temporarily, as we're scaffolding the new system into place. So it's not like you can just take the SAG funding and say, that's going away and we're going to put it in this new initiative, but we don't know if the new initiative works yet. We got to do my social work friends would call it concurrent case planning, right? We got to have parallel processes in place, which can be a hard sell financially, but we do have these funding streams coming in that potentially we can tap into. And I don't know who was next. So Sherry, I'll let you call on the next person.
Sherry, may I go ahead?
It's Lori, Michelle, and Cynthia.
Thank you. I was going to ask to go next too, so I could build off of what Valerie said. So my office is now located within CDCI, and I've been working with the BEST team because we have a local school district who wants to try to integrate early MTSS into their PBIS work. One of the challenges we're finding is we don't have the capacity because we don't have coaches to go to support this team. So we are trying to think about how do we blend this, really birth through early elementary and beyond system, but they are a TTA system, technical assistance, that's funded from the state for K through 12. There's no funding available for early MTSS. So as much as we want to support and help, we do ourselves come up against barriers of what we can do. To Valerie's point with technology, the pilot for early MTSS did integrate the use of cameras. It's called Camtasia, but it's not called Camtasia. Sorry, that's a different software. Excuse me. But anyways, and we were able to get access to National Head Start's coaching cloud, where we could safely store videos that our pilot sites were using. And they didn't have to be Head Start classrooms or collaboratives to have access to that cloud. So there's creative ways to make connections, to find ways to support a system, but we need the time and energy to do that. And in the next step that I most think about is that as researchers here at the university, we can help write policy. We can contribute our energy and our time in that way. And I'm thinking about Act 35, which is already placing mandates around suspension and expulsion for young children who are in that mixed delivery system that Katie was referring to. So places that are getting Act 166 dollars. So those are places that are already being held to a standard, but they may not have the supports that they need to reach that standard, which in and of itself is what's creating an inequity, which creates that fear, which creates, I think, that hesitancy to take children. And so there was a task force that was established to really think deeply on what supports are needed for settings to really enact Act 35, but it didn't include our early childhood community. It didn't include any representatives to think about, okay, we're thinking about equitable and inclusive school environments, but they were thinking about K through 12 environments. They weren't thinking about our children for birth through 6. So one policy recommendation I would make is I think we need to have this through legislation and have a task force that is specifically empowered to think about what it looks like to support this issue for young children.
What I was going to say is something I guess a little bit different than other folks, but I think one of the short-term goals that I see actually is maybe something very simple, but I think it's making sure that the private sector businesses, including family childcare, know who in their region to call when they're experiencing problems and who to refer people to. I've worked with child cares for, I won't tell you how long, it's been a long time across all sectors and jobs. And they don't always know who to call. And sometimes the players out in their regions change with different services. And I think that creates some barriers to getting access for families to services. And I think the other thing that I always think about too is that sometimes even when childcares are identifying that there are needs for referrals for children, is that families aren't always on board. So we always have to keep that in the back of our mind also, is how do we work through all of that, because that really creates a conundrum when families aren't on board, then we can't get services for kids. And sometimes that leads to the expulsion of the children because the kids aren't safe in the program, as Sonia had said, we have to keep kids safe. So anyway, that's what I think about, is just really us doing a good job as a system, making sure that we're constantly updating the field somehow through, maybe our state agencies as to who they can reach out to for families.
Thanks, Michelle. Shelley?
Lots of great conversation, and like Michelle, I've been in this for a long time. Like I recently won a prize for being the oldest person in a training. That was really sad. I am a huge proponent of the early MTSS system. And I feel like there's a lot, yes, there are lots of places that programs need support. And I think that professional development and the teacher that's in front of the kids, all of them, the professionals, the assistant teachers, they all have the biggest impact on the classroom. So I think like systematizing that early MTSS and the pyramid model trainings is always on my mind. And I think we could somehow, I know that Best happens to be having some staffing changes, and someone from our district is shifting into that role in January. And she's already reached out to me and she's like, what about early ed? And what about PBIS and early ed? And I'm like, the pyramid model is PBS. If you look on the website, that's what it is. And so I think this might be a little inroad for the people who are at UVM to be like, hey, Cassandra, like, let's talk some more about this. Because I think that there's a way to coordinate, and we don't want to add a different training track to anything that we're already doing. We don't want something fragmented. We don't want something different. We want it put into the career ladder. We want it planned through BFIS. We want it to be connected to the Early Ed Institute in the summer, but there's a way to like use this little staffing change as a way to say, hey, let's do it all together. So that's my thought. And I do feel like there's, huge silo issues around money. And I think a lot of our lack of services across town lines involves where money goes and where resources go and how our district's funded and how our providers funded. And it falls back to Act 166 allows parents to take their money anywhere, and for as SLP from our district to travel to, and we have students who are well over an hour and a half away from us who are getting their funding through us. So finding a way to look at those, the district lines would be awesome, like to reopen perhaps that project and that discussion about how do we have the money follow the kids.
Thanks, Shelley. Sonia?
I really liked, I agree with Shelley regarding the early MTSS. I think to me, it's likened to something like strengthening families, right? It's sort of a foundational, fundamental approach. The problem right now is, well, you might be able to get the training without the coaching and mentoring piece, which I've never found access to for my program. And I think it falls short for a lot of people. So I think all of the ideas that have come out around some short-term solutions around the mentoring and coaching are probably one of the most helpful pieces, would be one of the most helpful pieces, preemptive, if you will, that we could do. And I know it's tough because everybody's like, there's just not enough folks to go around anywhere, right? But assuming that wasn't the issue, if you ask simply like, what is a short-term thing? Or if we have funding, what could it go toward? For me, that would be a huge piece that I would say would be, and I agree that the early MTSS is one of those models to be used in that mentoring and coaching.
Thanks, Sonia. Cynthia must have remembered what she was going to say.
I
And then we'll go to
did.
Amy.
It was perfect that I couldn't remember because part of what other people said ties into this. The other piece that I was thinking of is, you know, in addition to this group, maybe thinking about a policy statement that we could promote to both the Agency of Education or the Child Development Division around investment for those short-term needs. You know, I was thinking of what Katie said on the West Virginia teams that are more regional. And so I'm wondering, you know, this group through the PIES report has really talked about what would it look like to set up some sort of regional coaching sort of teams. How might we look at other models like the West Virginia model? Tie it to this report, for instance, and then accessing Lori's idea around a task force, you know, kind of if something like that is created, charge that task force with really figuring this out. And in the back of my head, there's this noodling about if something like that happened in the more short term, so a task force thinking about like the West Virginia model, thinking about early MTSS and scaling that coaching, could that start to move the dialogue around particularly EEE services transferring across district lines more readily? And we already have, from Patty's example, a successful model there, successful example. So I just thinking about how these things could potentially build a little bit.
Thanks, Cynthia. Amy?
I agree. Just good conversation. You all always give me, you know, things to process and think about. I guess two separate things as we're talking. When we're talking about crossing lines, crossing district lines, that does occur. And it is difficult. And again, it's something that we hear about a lot at the AOE, you know, questions and concerns, calls coming in from families, you know, how can we get these services? How can we support our child? And you know, we have Act 166 kind of butting up against IDEA. So we do, when we work with programs in school districts, you know, it does seem like they are, you know, everybody has that common thought of trying to support the child, and they try to find ways, you know, sometimes they're able to contract, you know, through the school district where the child is located, you know, sometimes they're trying to do things via telehealth wise. So they are, you know, the exploration of how to kind of get through those barriers is definitely occurring, but I agree it might be something on a higher level that has to occur to really push that all the way through. And then, you know, just to kind of circle back with how we started this conversation and what Lori was saying, you know, we have all of this information saying we want to make this equitable across public and private programs. Early MTSS is something that could be helpful to support children, you know, each and every child. Universal practices, and then going up to additional supports. But how do we get that in place? And really coming back to the idea of us having the ability to make policy recommendations on the higher level, and pushing those thoughts up to, you know, for BBF to take that information and go to our legislators and say, hey, you know, is this something that, you know, that we can have a task force, like you were saying, Lori, that we can explore, because it, you know, there are places like, I think it's Pyramid 802 Plus. Am I saying their name right, Lori? So there's these entities out there that could possibly work with the private and public programs and helping to explore that coaching, you know, how do we get that in place? How do we scale up to that? But it is going to need to, I think, my perspective is to go to a higher level where maybe funding can be allocated to help that go across the state. So.
Thank you, Amy. Valerie?
Yeah, I want to build off of Amy's comment. So for those of you that are in that world of policy, authorship and advocacy. You know, we're all aware that there are different financial perspectives amongst the legislators. And so for some of them, it boils down to tax dollars. What does this cost? Trying to balance the budget. So, you know, what I always think about in terms of early intervention, right? And there's research out there that, you know, we could look to, which is, you know, when you invest in kids early on, you're changing the trajectory so that that early childhood investment really does equal, you know, some children will continue to need an intense level of needs across their entire, you know, educational trajectory. But for some students, that early investment means that they're going to be successful with just universal support or universal and intermediate support. So, you know, across the lifetime trajectory of these young people, this investment does make a difference in terms of the lifetime tax dollars that it takes to support them in their education and to fulfill their right to a free and appropriate public education. So, you know, whoever can boil that down to the 15 seconds of attention you have, right? Like that is one way to say, this is why this is worth investing in. And then I had another idea related to the finances, but I did lose it. But, you know, just to be aware that, you know, we may have to also address some people's hesitancy to invest additional tax dollars. And so how do we think about those persuasive arguments that are backed up by research? And looks like Katie has her hand up.
So you'll love this, Valerie. The thing that really gets public and political will on your side is data that shows that the investments are high quality and that they're paying off and that they're having good outcomes for children and families, right? And so I think as a state, we need to look at what data are we collecting and really then put it as part of our continuous improvement system. I know that QRAS was kind of tabled for a bit because of COVID. It's kind of in flux last I heard. I could be wrong. Others probably know. But really thinking about how as a state we're defining quality across these settings, because if we can demonstrate that and we have the numbers to back us up, you know, then you don't have to message as hard. You don't have to, you know, you're proving it again and again. And it's a way to keep improving and to invest where the money will make a difference.
Thanks, Katie. I just remembered my other point. So I agree with everything Katie just said, and that's now recorded so she can listen to that as many times as she wants in the future. The other piece is in the narrative, we talk about this issue, and this is where I get really passionate. It sits at the intersection of the child's right to an education and the parent's right to work. Parents are seeking out these settings because they want to work. So when parents can work, that's more tax revenue coming into our system. So that to me is like a win-win-win. It's a win for the kid. It's a win for the parent. It's a win for our state financial system. And right now, when we look at these questions about job vacancies and what's going on with employment, you know, people have dropped out of the workforce, and primarily it's been women that have dropped out of the workforce because COVID was the last thing that broke their ability to balance and juggle all of their responsibilities. And so I personally know people that have made that choice, and it's not just women, but you know, there is a gender dynamic there. So, you know, I think to the extent that we can have a strong workforce, build the capacity for all children that, you know, parents feel they want their child to be having this experience, and the workforce is prepared to meet the needs of all children, then we're creating opportunities for kids to have their best educational experience and for parents to be in the workforce.
Thank you, everyone. I think we're just about out of any last thoughts before I wrap up.
I wonder if I can just add some next steps.
Yes, Beth, love you too.
Okay, thank you. So I am jazzed by this conversation. You know, I think it's so productive to be able to take the research, to be able to bring to this group of very diverse stakeholders, right? To be able to say, what's here? Where is their agreement? What else needs to happen? Who does that? What resources might be at hand, right? So still more conversation to happen, but I think I really think it's productive to have. So thank you, Valerie, Lori, and Caitlin, for coming back to help be part of this conversation. In terms of some next steps, it's very good timing because I was actually just talking to Kate Rogers because she sits on the Early Childhood Interagency Coordinating Team, and that is another VCAP committee that is essentially all the state agency partners who serve on the State Advisory Council. And one of their priorities, long time going, has been around early MTSS. And so essentially we, at our meeting, I think it's next week or the week after, we are going to review where are we at with early MTSS and kind of this chronic struggle. It's a very well supported framework, however, lacking sustainable funding. So some of the specific recommendations I think are very timely. Now that committee, so anyway, just wanting to know that committee was scheduled already to talk about early MTSS, and I will definitely bring some of these recommendations to that group. So to the extent that this group can continue to synthesize, what are those policy recommendations, or what are the levers that we have both short and long term or potential with Build Back Better? I think that is the type of thinking that our system needs. So thank you all for your input. And I feel like it does make the system stronger when we can put our heads in and say, this is my experience, here are some things that are working, so that we can identify what's the lever that is that's available to us, and what do we want to reach for. So thank you.
Thank you, Beth. And, and I agree in terms of, I'm really excited about some really specific, tangible ideas that came out of this discussion that I think we can further synthesize and build on. I think it's good timing, not only what Beth just described as that the meeting that's going to happen around early MTSS, but we also next month have How Are Vermont's Children report. So that could give us more information. But I really do feel like really grounded and excited about some of these actionable ideas that we have here. So I think we have some, just to kind of maybe boil it down a little bit further and like Beth said, identify what exactly we want to recommend that will pull the levers that that will have some at least short-term and intermediary impact. So thank you to the UVM team for coming back, and we maybe inviting you again soon. Valerie, I wondered if you could just send me a link for the notes to you talked about the I-Team and the early I-Team. That'd be great if you just sent me the best place for people to learn more about that. Trying to think if I had any other questions for you before you guys. No, I think that's it, but I think that's great. Really great conversation, really great ideas for us to really get behind that could make a difference. So thank you all for coming again. The next part of our agenda was going to be Nicole was going to lead some updates just on the recovery funding and some of the impacts that could be having more immediately. I didn't know if there's anyone on here that wants to has any announcements around that. I do know that more than 70% of all the registered and licensed early childhood programs have already applied for ARPA. Thank you, UVM team. And those, those checks started going out in November. So that program is has no deadline. People can join that program. What happens is the number of checks you get is reduced, but depending on when you apply for that program. But that program is a program that people could continue to apply for, and even new programs that are opening maybe in 2022 are going to be eligible for some payment related to those funds. So that program is up and running, and I don't know if Lori. It looks like Sonia left. Lori, I don't know if you have any, not to put you on the spot, but any feedback about how that program's working for you?
We haven't had any like issues. I mean, it's great. I mean, we're so grateful for the support. So nothing. I do think like I did hear some conversations statewide with other providers around some confusion around how that was all calculated because of the difference between what people got with the CRRSA funding and the ARPA funding, and the ARPA being more money as a whole, and people maybe not really understanding that, yes, but this is going to serve more programs. So I haven't been directly a part of those discussions, but I am aware of those discussions happening. But no, we're just incredibly grateful for the support.
Thank you, Lori. And yes, it was because it is eligible on an ongoing basis through most of 2022, CDD has to prepare for that. So they have to set aside funds, not only, for programs that they have to assume 100% take up at this point, and also try to guess what might be some new programs that are eligible, which has resulted in some programs getting less than they expected, knowing how large the pot of money was. Sonia, did you have any other input on that?
Yeah, I would just echo a little bit of what Lori just said regarding folks, and just a little bit of confusion, but I think it's pretty easily explained to them. I know there's been some pretty good uptake in Loyal. I've talked to several directors. I know it's huge help for us. We use it almost solely for compensation, which is amazing, because we want to keep the precious few we have. We need to pay them a lot better than we do. So it's just been incredible. And, my hope with this kind of funding has always been, this is a short-term gap filler for, that if we do this long enough, and this is the kind of thing people are using it for, it's going to be hard. When it goes away, there will have to be some movement to figuring out how it's filled, or we'll probably implode, frankly. I think it's been a great thing. And from everybody I've talked to, they're just very grateful. It's a very easy process, obviously. This time, about as easy as it gets, so.
And Sonia, that makes a good point, because we often talk about the cliffs that our families fall off of. And in essence, we're creating a cliff for our workforce. And so that's what we have to get out there, is that realization that in order to keep our people, we've needed to increase that pay. And then we're creating a life-changing cliff, and the programs are going to sink as well.
Thanks, Diane. Janet, did Vermont AUIC have any updates they can share around how the recovery funds? Sure.
Well, I think the point I put into the chat that I just want to make sure folks know is that public pre-K programs, public school pre-K programs are eligible as well. And our understanding is in looking at the take-up rate and looking at which programs haven't applied, a lot of them are the public school programs. And I get that anyway, the information about the program is not going to the people that would actually apply, right? Like it's going to the UPK coordinator and not to the business office. And so anyway, I just would encourage anybody who is engaging with public school folks to make sure that message gets out there.
Shelley? I think you froze, Shelley.
No, I didn't. I didn't hear my name. I thought I heard Jen, and I was like, okay.
Oh, okay.
I was waiting for you. Sorry. So it took a little bit of convincing to apply as a public school district. Our grant managers are totally tapped and fried because the ESSER money is crazy and there's procurement processes and all of those things that make it really hard to manage that other money. So this money really is easy money. I mean, yeah. So, and I was feeling like we are better resourced and should we apply? And some people on this call convinced me that we should. So just so you know.
Matt?
It's a more general comment. I know Laura, you were trying to say something. If it's on this topic, I don't know if you want to chime in, because I was going to go in a slightly different direction, but
I just had a quick question around reach out to family home providers. And I'm only asking because recently, so this was all happening at the same time that I was teaching strengthening business practices to family home providers. And some of them seem to not know like about these pots of money. And I just didn't know, is there a specific outreach to family home providers in particular? And I don't know if it's because they're not signed up or they don't get correspondence, but I was doing a lot of forwarding to people, and I don't, or maybe there's some way to take the temperature of like, what's the percentage of family home providers that are eligible that have gotten it. I just wanted to have a little voice for them to make sure they get what they need.
Thanks, Lori. It's interesting. In the beginning, when the program was announced, the family childcare homes were applying at a much faster rate than center-based programs, which was interesting. CDD has asked some of the partners, Vermont AYC, Let's Grow Kids, Vermont After School, had asked them to do some outreach before the December 10th deadline, because that anyone who applies before then is eligible for the 12 full payments. So there was some like specific call made to family childcare homes on that list. So yeah, there has been some specific outreach, but in the beginning, they were the high percentage apply. They were on it. Matt?
Yeah, so to sort of speak to Sonia's point, but not exactly. I just want to note that I think Sonia's pointing to the long term. Sherry, this program we're talking about is very short term, or short and medium term. Also looking kind of medium term, I just want to recognize the work so LGK is leading it, Vermont AYC is part of it, we're part of it as well, and so is the PCC network. There's a collaborative effort to try to develop a menu of suggestions for how to spend some of the one-time money, whether it's ARPA or state, to try to do some hole plugging and system supporting. It's not going to be the answer. It's not going to be the solution to the cliff issue that's on. I'm trying to undersell and over deliver here. But an effort is being undertaken. Suggestions are being made to legislative leaders. Stay tuned to hear more about that. Once the legislature comes in, I think there'll be more heat on that. The administration, I don't know exactly what the administration's stance is, but I don't want to speak for them. There's no opposition here. I think we're all pulling in the same direction. I think there'll be a range of opinion about what to do, but it's not like anyone has to be convinced about the need. So just folks can look for more advocacy activity on that, obviously request to participate as is appropriate for everyone. But Sherry, felt like it was important to note that there's sort of another piece that's trying to slot into the overall effort. We talked about throwing a rope to build a bridge to get across the there are multiple steps to try to rescue the system that's teetering. Anyway, so look for more on that in the weeks ahead.
Thanks, Matt. Shelley?
Sorry, I didn't put my hand down. It was up and then.
Come on, Shelley.
Well, I was going to say, Google does that for you. It says, it looks like you're talking. I'm going to put your hand down now. So, thank you.
I wondered, many of you know that municipalities also receive recovery funds that can be spent on childcare. And Laura, you went to your town, and I'm just wondering if you have any update on that experience.
So just to give you a brief history, so I went to the town with a very specific ask, although in going through that process and working with our select board members, we found that we qualified in almost all the categories based on the work that we do and a lot of early childhood programs do. I specifically went and asked for $55,000 because during our 2020-2021 fiscal year, our teachers did not get any raises. And we had been working really hard towards moving towards getting to a minimum of $15 an hour in preparation for the new expected minimum wage at some point, which of course is not livable, but minimum. And we still are a few dollars away from that per hour for our starting wages. And so we haven't offered sign-on bonuses, but we've been dealing with a staffing shortage since our first COVID case back in 2020, and have went into the school year down 5 teachers. So I was really looking for a way to retain our teachers pretty immediately, because I really can't afford to lose any more teachers or I'm going to be closing classrooms. And so I asked them for $55,000 to support our workforce in particular, that money to go directly to educators, and they did approve it. And I expect that we will get the money this month and our educators will get the retroactive wages that they missed out during that COVID year. So yeah. And for our new staff to retain them as well, there's also a system for them, but it's just another. And my plan is, although I've just been completely very far behind, is to work with our entire Bennington County Starting Points Network and developing a letter to go to all other area towns, and using this as like a model of encouragement for other towns to also consider designating some of that ARPA funds. It's a pretty easy fit, to be honest. So thank you.
Lori, that is such a great story. I think we're going to end the meeting on that. I don't want any more. No. If anyone has anything else to share that is not good news, like Lori's incredible story, good for you and your advocacy. That's amazing. No, seriously, if anyone does anyone have any other questions or anything else to share? I'm serious. It makes me, oh, Janet and Eddie, it makes me feel so, this is like you just made my day. Janet and Eddie, we'll go. Janet,
I have more good news to share, which is that we, around the Teach Scholarship Program. So we are able to, some of you may know, for the Teach Program Design, it was Teach Program Design is a partnership between the student, the early childhood educator, right, who's a student, as well, their employer who sponsors them, and Vermont AUIC. And in the past, we've been able to, the Teach program has contributed 80% of the scholarship dollars, and then the student and their employer were responsible for 10% of them. And sort of thanks to the expanded budget that is a result of sort of years of advocacy by this, including from many members of this group for the Teach program, and then the expanded budget that was able to be approved thanks to ARPA dollars last spring. We are eliminating the co-pays for sponsoring programs and for students within the Teach program. So we're super excited about that. And so we made that retroactive to the start for this fall. And we still have space to enroll additional students with Teach scholarships this coming semester. So if we've started the process of spreading the word, but if any of you have places where you can spread the word too, we'd appreciate that. But it felt really good to be able to go back to folks and say, those bills we sent you, forget it. Or, we sent you a check for $50 for your bonus minus your tuition, or, we're going to send you another check to make up for it. And I think it's just really nice. It's a really important relief measure. And it also we also want to make sure the Teach scholarship is, which is supporting people who already are early childhood educators, is even more, is generous. I mean, it needs to be as generous as other scholarship programs that are either coming into play, or, the critical occupation scholarships or other things that are in play. So we want to make sure that those early childhood educators who've committed to this field already and are advancing their education are getting the most generous support we can offer. So exciting.
That's awesome. Eddie, good news.
Thanks, Eddie. Eddie Gale with the A.D. Henderson Foundation. Thanks for letting me listen in, and forgive me if I'm asking the absolute obvious, but is anyone keeping track of how all of these funds going to programs are being used? Because if they're across the board, universally being used for salaries, that's just this enormously powerful statement.
So the child that I'm assuming there's no, I don't think anyone else is on because Nicole had an emergency and had to leave. They do ask how you're using them. And so they will know, they can track and say how they've been used. So there's categories and they would check when you applied what you were going to use them for. So there should be some that would, how detailed that tracking is really not happening because they were trying to make the reporting very light. Oh, there's Leslie. She can, there, I didn't see you. Sorry, Leslie's on. She might have an answer to that. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Leslie. I'm pretty new to CDD and I'm new to this meeting. So hi, everybody. I had to be late today, so I apologize for that. But yeah, so to try and keep the paperwork as really streamlined and simple as possible, people were asked what their intention was for the money. And then in the reporting, there is going to be a survey that goes out later at the end of the program to find out more information about how they did end up actually spending the funds. So that's the intention right now. So hopefully we will be able to get that information. So we'll have that data to report forward.
Okay. Great, and I assume lots of other people to follow up with stories of how they made it work for their centers.
Thank you, Leslie. I didn't see you I lost you in my screen. So glad you're here. Thanks for that.
Of course.
Great. So I think we're finished with today's meeting. Beth, is there anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up? I talked about next in January, the Building Bright Futures team will be presenting the State of Vermont Children's Report. So that's kind of a great follow-up to today's meeting. Anything else, Beth?
It's a great conversation. So thank you all for leaning in and joining us. Double duty this week. Thanks for joining yesterday for the Systems Analysis Advisory Committee. Just really appreciate your time and your engagement. So
Sherry,
have a great holiday.
Yeah, Lori,
Did
you want to say?
Yeah, I should add, because I didn't tell the whole story. When I first asked, they sort of delayed me, and we had a private foundation come forward and give them a timeline and offer to match that $55,000. So in the end, we ended up with 110. So we did have, because I didn't want it to make it seem like, oh, it's super easy, just go ask your town.
No, I know.
There was a process of having to get some key stakeholders in our community on board to say, like, listen, we need them to keep their doors open. Like, this is important to businesses. So that's just another piece of the puzzle that I think is worth mentioning as well.
Lori, that's awesome. Good for you. Lori, we're working with the Vermont City of Leagues and Towns to create a webinar for municipalities, and I might be tapping into you to be as part of the panel about your experience. So
that's great. And I think
just to give you a heads up. Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.